role of inclusive education in creating a better society for the future. Inclusive education works to identify all barriers to education and to remove the covers from everything from curricula to pedagogy and then teaching itself. Does inclusive education disable students' right to equity and fairness? Hmm, that's something to think about. But before we even dive into it, I want to be able to be honest about some of the problems and concerns as or challenges as it relates to inclusive education. Education with students with special needs have come a very long way. From special education to integrated education, and from integrated education to inclusive education. Children with special needs require education in regular school, in their own society, and by regular teachers. Inclusion values diversity. Inclusion values diversity. It acknowledges every learner's fundamental right to learn and accept that every child has unique abilities and needs. But oftentimes inside the classroom, whether it's elementary, middle, high, or even higher education, sometimes this special population needs and their ability to learn is often clumped together. That's not inclusivity, and that's not diversity being acknowledged or even implied. And some of the concerns and issues that are faced in inclusive education as it relates to children with special needs include characteristics of individualized pupils. We know that every student with special needs sitting in a classroom together is already going to be identified in one lump sum. They're not individualized, they're part of the mainstream education. A lack of access to the mainstream. At present, only 4 to 5% of children with special needs out of 30 million have access to an adequate education or education in general. There is a lack of awareness and attitude. The whole idea of inclusive education is defeated due to a lack of awareness, positive attitude, insensitivity on the part of teachers, classmates, parents, and the community. As a mom of four, I have my youngest son has a neurological tic disorder. Unfortunately, there weren't too many youth that we knew in my community, in my culture, or even in my son's school that had a neurological tic disorder. At one point, it was defined as Tourette's, then it wasn't Tourette's, and then it was this and it was that. And it started to have a negative impact on my son until because people around him couldn't identify it, they couldn't relate to it, and they didn't even know how to address it. There's a lack of trained teachers. And we know today, as a result of even prior to pre pandemic, as a result of the pandemic, we have less certified teachers in the classroom and an increase of substitute teachers that are not necessarily qualified to teach or teach in subject areas in education. There are large class sizes. What happened pre-pandemic is that some classroom sizes, it could be one teacher to 30 students. It could be one teacher to 40 students in regular public education settings. And in private schools, there could be one teacher to 10 to 12 students. But those large class sizes are more of the norm and the exception versus the exception. And now that we're somewhat post-pandemic, those large sizes are once again live, not Memorex. There's a lack of child-centered and relevant curriculum. I know curriculum in my district right now, and even a neighboring school district, is something that we still battle. Is it relevant? Is it helpful? Is it closing those gaps that we know that has always existed regardless of the pandemic? Curriculum in a child-centered curriculum are still huge issues in education. There is a lack of proper infrastructure, especially for students with special needs. There's a lack of activities that students can take part in. There's a lack of involvement in parent community. And it's funny because earlier this week, I had an opportunity to speak at a launch of a new justice coalition, and I spoke on the need of community schools and community engagement. And community partnerships, we know, is an absolute solution to the educational needs here in the US, but it's also a huge disparity and a deficit for so many reasons. And while there is finger pointing or the gaps widening as opposed to closing, our students, especially students with special needs, are caught dead smack in the middle. There's a lack of accountability, there's a lack of partnerships, there's a lack of collaboration, of consultation. One of the feedback that I received from my speech when I talked about community schools is that our local school system felt like I attacked them because I spoke about my professional experience that hinders collaboration to take a positive movement forward. And my response was, even if I didn't address it, someone would be offended. But if we're really looking for change to make education inclusive for all and to ensure that we're dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, we have to be honest in what those concerns are. And community partnerships happen to be one of them. If we always say in education that there are no concerns, that everything is great, and that we can move on without having to reevaluate or examine what's happening, we'll never be able to improve the education process, protocols, and system for our students because we'll always be operating blinded. And so, collaboration and annual consultation is one of those problems and concerns in today's world, not just for mainstream students, but also students with special needs. There's a lack of support, there's peer rejection for those students when they have a disability because of the lack of awareness, the lack of teaching, the lack of role modeling, the lack of behavior modeling that continues to fall through the cracks. And last but not least, labeling. I know a lot of students that hate to be labeled because they have a disability. And these problems and concerns, when we talk about inclusivity or inclusion, values, diversity, it comes back to the word diversity. Students today or education will never be identified or a solution based off the word education. And what I love about the world is that it's a melting pot. And within those melting pots, there are sub melting pots. And when we're talking about or even relating to the role of inclusive education in creating a better society for the future, the number one thing that we have to hone on is that diversity, and that inclusion values not just diversity in a word, but the diversity of what that looks like. Every person's hair is different. Every person learns different. Every person not just learn different, but every person happens to be different, from DNA to eye color to being a visual learner to being an auditory learner to be kinesthetic. And that's what I love about the highly effective the multiple intelligences, right? The multiple intelligence teaches us as individuals and as experts that there are intelligences in how people learn best. I know for me that I'm a hands-on person, I'm auditory, and I have kinesthetic intelligence. In today's world, what I've learned from my students or my kids, my own youth, is that the best way for them to absorb a lesson is to read and have something in their ear. And that bothers me because I'm like, how do you navigate your attention? And for them, that's how they learn best. But that's not covered in Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence. And I had an interview on my show not too long ago, and an adult who I've never heard before say the same thing. They learn best when reading or writing by listening to music. I think that needs to be added as an intelligence. And that's something when I'm thinking about inclusion, valuing diversity, that is a diverse aspect that is not only impactful for today's youth, but also adults. And for our students with special needs, they have their own way of absorbing, acknowledging, and learning that's not necessarily honored and appreciated. And of course, with every problem and concern, as we talk about in, the role of inclusive education in creating a better society for the future, is not just the problems but also the solutions. And there are 5 principal solutions that I just want to put on a table out there as we're talking about students with special needs. And number 1 is diversity in the classroom enriches and strengthens education. Every student is unique, and every group of students are different. Diversity in schools is a given, and learners have different experiences, cultures, beliefs, and values. But unfortunately, the curriculum and the student centered approach, the lack of trained teachers, the lack of support, the lack of collaboration, the lack of consultation, unfortunately, doesn't allow that diversity of students to be acknowledged and adapted to in terms of teaching and learning. And if we want to really be able to create a better society based on the role of inclusive education, we have to be able to acknowledge what's happening in today's world. Back in the 1950s, were different from the 1940s. The 1980s were different from the 1970s. The turn of the century was different from the 1990s. We're currently in 2022, post pandemic. It's different from the way it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. But unfortunately, we're trying to force the old with the current in its butting heads. And it's not just butting heads, it's widening the disparity gap. And if we want to make education today more inclusive for a better society tomorrow, we have to embrace the diversity in the classroom and understanding that that diversity enrich and strengthens education. Number 2, there is a strength-based and personalized curriculum. Now, it sounds simple, but it's extremely complex. But it was complex even before diversity got to the level where it is today. When we look at Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence, he's showing us and identifying us 7 unique ways in which people learn. Mainstream kids, not even including those with special needs or any type of disability, just people in general learn different. They comprehend different. They absorb and apply what they learn in a different way. And in society today, There are magnet programs or magnet schools. There are chartered schools. There's public education. There's private education. There's homeschool education. And all of these different variations of how people can learn on what format does help slightly, but even within their own territory, they're different. And when we're thinking about strengthening the base of our education through curriculum, it is through personalization. Every student learns differently. But unfortunately, in today's society, education systems don't have the funding, the finance, or necessarily the interest to personalize curriculum. Strength based approaches to education are key for inclusive education. They recognize that each student has an inherent strength and talent. And when you can hone in on the strength and talent of each student, then we're closing those gaps. Then that role of inclusive education is helping for a better tomorrow. But until we get to that level, there's still work to be done. The strength-based and personalized curriculum improves student engagement, motivation, academic outcomes for all students, and there there is an ability or an idea to celebrate diversity and different that facilitate opportunities for personalized learning. Let me say that again. This approach of strength-based and personalized curriculum celebrates diversity and difference, and it facilitates opportunity for personalized learning. Where's the loss? There is none. There's a win-win across the board. Principle 3, student engagement, agency, and voice. Seeking a perspective in students ensures that they are making a meaningful contribution to their schooling and educational experiences. They have the ability to voice both student participation and agency. When students are given a platform to share their voice, schools gain their knowledge and better understanding of the student's experience. In my speech recently, when I talked about community and schools and community engagements, I asked the audience literally to look to their left, look to their right, and look behind them. And I asked the audience, how many youth did they see in the audience? And the answer was 0. When we're talking about doing things on behalf of students, or talking about community partnerships or community engagements or even community leadership, unfortunately, oftentimes youth are not included in that discussion. And that's a huge disparity. Youth are not leaders of tomorrow, they're leaders of today. They are our current leaders. They are leaders already. But unfortunately, adults may not see that. They're always trying to make impact and solutions without asking the students' insight. And when that is part of the culture and the norm, then when we're talking about inclusive education for a better future, there will not be a better future until we help students to learn the power of their voices and being able to teach them, to mold them, and to help them model it will make society better for tomorrow. Well, I'm going to start with the latter first. When I hear voice, I hear advocacy. And to me, advocacy is always the number one way to go. There's only two ways to lend your voice in a world: through writing or speaking. And in today's society, there's not enough of that happening for adults, let alone our youth. Depending on the culture, depending on the upbringing, depending on a household environment, children are seen but not heard. And that belief transcends from the home into school. So instead of students using their voice to address concerns that impact them, they remain silent. And when they remain silent, especially if they are a child with special needs, then they continue to fall through the cracks and a lot of things are missed. But when they're encouraged and inspired to use their voice, then they begin to advocate for things that matters most to them. And that's always going to be a win. Seeking the perspective of students create buy-in. And it is different from what we were taught growing up, but it's not in what you say, it's all about the presentation and the manner. And if we can teach youth, mainstream or youth with special needs, to advocate for who they are and what they believe in and what matters to them, it will lead to a better society, because instead of them being numb or quiet when they're being violated, when they're experiencing peer pressure, when things don't fit the mold for them, they're learning to be respectful and to use their voice in ways that will not only help them, but help their culture, their society, and their long term goals. Students' roles are often consultative rather than active. Let me come back to that. And what makes student engagement, agency, and voice important is because when it's inquired what students are looking for, and then they can lend their voice to change, you're engaging them, and then they become their greatest asset and moving forward through advocacy. And then their capabilities and their belief, their self-esteem, their leadership, their role playing, their role modeling, all of those things lead to an increase in respect, relationships, and even trust in a community. And that is wholeheartedly important. And then number 4, engaging all your critical stakeholders. You know, we often hear there is no one way to skin a cat, and that is absolutely true. And inclusive education is where all students of all capabilities can grow and learn. This means that each student and parent will have access to accurate information on their learning through ongoing formative and summative assessments of each student's progress. Students can model positive behavior and feedback while still offering areas of improvement. Over time, this creates a positive community perception of the school and raises awareness about positive school culture. And we know that perception is perception in hindsight is 2020, and the only way to help continue to develop that positive onset of how people are viewing and experiencing education today is to continue to live it and to buy into it. Extremely important. Principle number 5, inclusive teachers need commitment, knowledge, and practical skills. There are more than 50% of substitute teachers in a classroom today. Not because they necessarily want to be there, but because a lot of teachers left the system as a result of the pandemic. And teachers felt undervalued. Teachers felt overstressed and overwhelmed. Teachers were struggling with their own mental health. And it was having a negative impact in the 2.5 years that we dealt with the pandemic. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of teachers to leave to leave education. Good teaching is good teaching for all, not just some. But in order for good teaching to take part, teachers have to feel respected. They need commitment. They need an enhanced and professional development. They need more knowledge and not just being told what they need to do just to get through each day. Teaching in inclusive classrooms requires teachers that have the three H's: heart, commitment; head, critical knowledge; and hands, practical strategies. Heart, commitment; head, critical knowledge; and hands, practical strategies. Teachers must feel fully committed to include all learners. They need to understand inclusive practices, benefit all students, regardless if they have additional needs or not. One of the problems that we see with an upchuck of substitute teachers in a classroom, some are coming to the table with degrees, some are not. Some are coming to the table depending on the leadership that's overseeing the educational leadership. They're learning on a job where they might get some hindsight as to the diversity of students with special needs or behavior, but most often they're not getting any of this training. And so when we're talking about the three H's, heart, head, and hands, unfortunately, substitute teachers they might have the heart, or they might have the hands, or they might have the head, but they're not coming to the table with all three. And when they're unfortunately not coming to the table with all three, and it's not reinforced in professional development training or access or any of that mentorship, then our students are feeling the brunt of it. And not just mainstream students, but especially students with special needs. Inclusive education also benefit teachers. Strategies are used that make classrooms more engaging, and it can lead to professional satisfaction. Inclusion requires teachers to acquire critical knowledge and skills to be able to teach our students. And that includes assessment for learning, peer tutoring, and even cooperative learning. We must not forget that teachers and the three H's need to be adequately supported by the school leadership team and to sustain inclusive practices. Number three, principle three, student engagement, agency, and voice. Seeking a perspective in students ensures that they are making a meaningful contribution to their schooling and educational experiences. They have the ability to voice both student participation and agency. When students are given a platform to share their voice, schools gain their knowledge and better understanding of the student's experience. In my speech recently, when I talked about community in schools and community engagements, I asked the audience literally to look to their left, look to their right, and look behind them. And I asked the audience, how many youth did they see in the audience? And the answer was 0. When we're talking about doing things on behalf of students, or talking about community partnerships or community engagements or even community leadership, unfortunately, oftentimes youth are not included in that discussion. And that's a huge disparity. Youth are not leaders of tomorrow. They're leaders of today. They are our current leaders. They are leaders already. But unfortunately, adults may not see that. They're always trying to make impact and solutions without asking the student's insight. And when that is part of the culture and the norm, then when we're talking about inclusive education for a better future, there will not be a better future until we help students to learn the power of their voices and being able to teach them, to mold them, and to help them model it will make society better for tomorrow. One scenario I want to bring full circle before I begin to wrap this up, when we're talking about students with special needs and inclusive education, and it hits directly on everything that I'm mentioning today, not just the problems, but even the tangible solutions that could really make a difference. I have my one of as I mentioned, I am a mom of four. I am an educator of 30 plus years. And even as an educator, when I take off the hat, I'm a parent first. And even having an insight and knowledge of how the school system worked from K-12 all the way up to the doctoral level and back down, as a parent, I'm still running into challenges with my children who are in the school system. I have a daughter who has a processing disorder and recalling, and she has a visual impairment. And her visual impairment is one of her eyes. It's not round. It's I forgot what it's called. But long story short, she's not able to wear glasses anymore. She has to wear specialized contacts. And this came about her freshman year, which was about 2.5 years ago. Um, and as she was going through this, it was the double vision, the sensitivity to light, blurriness, the processing of recalling. And as an educator, I reached out to the school to um, request assessments. It's called an IEP or 504. IEP, Individualized Education Plan, or 504, which are accommodations, so that we could see what was going on with her as we were tackling the visual impairment problem with her eyes. The letter went to the school right around April of 2021. An IEP meeting, which is the next step once the request is formally made, because it happened in May and school gets out in June. The experts, which I yielded to, recommended a 504. A 504 plan is an accommodation that can be um, implemented, but not necessarily required. And we'll have to come back to that. But it's all part of this inclusive education that should make my daughter's scenario better than what it actually was. So the 504 plan was put into place, and it helped as the 504 with accommodations were put into play. And some of the accommodations that had to be put in place is that my daughter could no longer sit in front of a screen. So they did audio for her to be able to listen to work. There were textbooks that was provided for her because she couldn't sit in front of the screen because we were still dealing with the pandemic. Fast forward, it helped. The following year, which would have been her sophomore year, we were to come back and then revisit the IEP. The IEP would allow assessments to see exactly what was going on with her second issue, which was processing recalling. It didn't work. We fought tooth and nail for a whole year to get her accommodations in place, and it didn't happen. And mind you, my daughter has a voice. She knows how to advocate for herself. And as a parent, I'm advocating for her, and it fell on deaf ears. Her grade point average dropped. And here's the irony of it all. When I talk advocacy from a parent level and a student level and believing in the processes, we went from teacher to in between administrator all the way up to the principal. And nothing changed. My daughter suffered. Her grade point average suffered. Her self-esteem suffered. Her lack of belief in the school system suffered. And it was agonizing. Luckily, we were able to pull some wins out of it. And so instead of staying for her junior year, my daughter was able to had earned enough credits to skip her junior year. She's now a senior. Come back full force over the summer. We wanted to be proactive again and move from a 504 to an IEP, and we were denied. Finally, the 504 was put into place, allegedly, and once again, we're battling for her accommodations to be put in place. And when we're talking about the role of inclusive education and how it can have an impact for a better society for the future, if we don't understand the processes as it relates to our students with special needs, we're not creating a better society for the future. We're creating headaches that's never ending. When we talk about inclusion, values, diversity, inclusion means all students. And unfortunately, there are a lot of pitholes and pitfalls in the education system today that are not being acknowledged, not being addressed, and being overlooked. While there are solutions out there that can automatically help, it has to be a collective and collaborative approach if we're going to help students, parents, the society become better individuals. Because if not, then we're running into problems that are bigger than us. In conclusion, and bringing this full circle, with my daughter, it's still a day-to-day uphill battle, but she's worth it. And I'm a very active and engaged parent, leader, and advocate. And it's still not enough. But it has to be enough, and we're learning along the way. When we're thinking about the role of inclusive education in creating a better society for the future, and my question is, does inclusive education disable student rights to equity and fairness? Depending on how you can look at it, it could be a yes or a no. However, the realization of the slogan of the millennium, education for all, is not possible unless educational opportunities are provided to all, including the children with special needs. It is very real. And we have to be able to acknowledge that diversity values, that inclusion values diversity, but we're not addressing the diversity or acknowledging that diversity exists beyond race or gender or ethnicity. Knowing the massive number of children with special needs and limitations of the formal system, non-formal and informal mode of education must provide their support. Our students and all students should have an opportunity to a fair education. And inclusive education is absolutely a solution that is viable for a better society for the future. But we first have to acknowledge where there are pitfalls and where the disparity exists, and that it will take collaboration versus competition to make a difference. I'll leave on a note that with collaboration and platforms like the one that we're taking a part in, to be able to learn, acknowledge, compare, and contrast, that is a step in the right direction. But we need more hands on transformational leaders that are not just willing to talk about it, but willing to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty. And the more that we're able to get up and get our hands dirty, the better off we're making room for at least one person, whether it's a pupil, a parent, a leader in the community, but it's a legacy that we know that we've contributed positive to. So, does inclusive education disable students' right to equity and fairness? In one hand, absolutely, if you're only looking at the problems and concerns. And then absolutely not, if you are that transformational leader that's moving and shaking and making, and not just making in theory, but applying the strategies and solutions that are just basic. So this is Dr. Takima Dorsey. I'm the CEO of DTD Enterprises, keynote speaker, author, podcaster, and the list goes on and on. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to discuss, does inclusive education disable students' rights to equity and fairness, and to bring a voice for students with disability or special needs. They're not talked about often enough. And when we're thinking about the role of inclusive education in today's society, we must include them. Thank you. Have a great day. And if you want to connect, please reach out to me at www.drtakimadorsey.com.